Fatima watched the billionaire mock his own mother in front of Manhattan's elite, calling her just a simple Bedouin woman who spoke no English, and felt something inside her snap. When she knelt beside the trembling elderly woman and spoke in the ancient desert dialect almost no one remembered anymore, the entire restaurant froze, including the son who suddenly realized his mother possessed a dignity he'd spent millions trying to buy. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. The hush that fell over the Meridian, one of Manhattan's most exclusive restaurants, was deafening. Waiters froze mid-step, diners set down their forks, and the soft jazz music seemed to fade into the background. All eyes turned to the corner table where an impeccably dressed businessman laughed dismissively at his elderly mother, wrapped in traditional black abaya. His booming voice cut through the air in perfect English. "My mother speaks no English. She's just a simple Bedouin woman from the desert." The elderly woman's eyes dropped to her lap, her weathered hands trembling slightly. No one dared speak up until a young waitress approached the table. What happened next would change everything. Fatima Hassan had never been the type to seek out confrontation. She was 28, juggling 2 jobs, a mountain of student loan debt, and a demanding course load at NYU, where she was pursuing her master's degree in Middle Eastern studies. But this was life in New York City, a constant balancing act between survival and ambition. When Fatima was offered a part-time position at the Meridian, a Michelin-starred establishment perched in the heart of Manhattan's financial district, she leaped at the chance. The tips alone could help her stay afloat in a city where money flowed like water, but rarely settled in the hands of people like her. Nestled on the top floor of a gleaming glass tower, the Meridian was known for its contemporary American cuisine with global influences and an atmosphere that screamed wealth and power. The staff wore sleek black uniforms with silver accents, and each employee was trained to an impeccable standard. Head chef Marcus Sterling had worked in 3 Michelin-star restaurants across Europe, and rumor had it that celebrities, tech moguls, and even foreign dignitaries dined there regularly. The pressure that came with such clientele was extraordinary. Yet Fatima believed the job was worth it. The pay was decent, the tips potentially life-changing, and the environment polished enough to look impressive on her resume. Each day, Fatima arrived 2 hours before her shift to help with setup, meticulously folding napkins into elegant shapes, polishing wine glasses until they sparkled under the recessed lighting, and memorizing every detail of the day's menu. She learned that if Chef Sterling was in a demanding mood, the staff had to be 3 steps ahead of any request. If the sommelier had a special recommendation, servers needed to describe it flawlessly, complete with tasting notes and regional history. Everything mattered: your posture, your tone, your ability to read a table's mood. She was exhausted most nights, but oddly satisfied. Something about delivering perfect service energized her. She likened it to a performance. Every gesture choreographed, every word carefully chosen, every smile genuine yet professional. Within weeks, Fatima found her rhythm. She charmed anniversary couples, impressed corporate groups celebrating mergers, and navigated the demands of wealthy international visitors seeking New York's finest. She was thrilled when her first substantial tip arrived, a crisp $300 from a venture capitalist who appreciated her knowledge of Lebanese wines. That money went straight toward her tuition payment. Outside the restaurant, Fatima's world was decidedly more modest. Her tiny studio in Queens was barely big enough for a bed and a desk, but she'd made it feel like home, with colorful textiles from her grandmother's village and photographs of the desert landscapes her family came from. Despite the challenges, Fatima was determined to honor her family's journey, from the Bedouin deserts of Jordan to the crowded streets of New York. Her grandmother had taught her that education was the greatest treasure, and Fatima carried that wisdom like a compass. This particular Saturday evening, she had no idea that her life was about to change forever. It was a busy night, reservations fully booked with what the maitre d' described as high-profile guests. That was the night Rasheed Al-Mansour walked through the doors of the Meridian, his elderly mother on his arm. Rasheed Al-Mansour was known in certain circles as the Desert Prince, though he'd spent more time in Manhattan penthouses than he ever had in the Arabian deserts his grandfather once roamed. At 42, he'd built a real estate empire that stretched from Dubai to London to New York, specializing in luxury developments that catered to the ultra-wealthy. Forbes had recently featured him in an article about Middle Eastern entrepreneurs reshaping global markets. The piece mentioned his Harvard MBA, his collection of vintage sports cars, and his reputation as a ruthless negotiator who never lost a deal. What the article didn't mention was how far he distanced himself from his roots. Born in a small village outside Amman, Jordan, Rasheed had worked tirelessly to shed every trace of his humble beginnings. He'd perfected his American accent at boarding school in Connecticut, adopted Western business attire exclusively, and rarely spoke Arabic unless absolutely necessary for business dealings. To him, his past represented everything he'd fought to escape: poverty, limitation, and the narrow horizons of desert life. His mother, Salma Al-Mansour, was 73 years old and represented everything Rasheed had tried to leave behind. She'd grown up in a Bedouin tribe, learning to read the desert stars for navigation, to weave intricate patterns into textiles, and to recite poetry passed down through generations. She spoke only Arabic and the ancient Bedouin dialect her grandmother had taught her. When Rasheed's father had died 2 years ago, Salma had insisted on moving to New York to be near her only son, despite his protests. She lived in a modest apartment in Bay Ridge, Brooklyn, surrounded by other Arab immigrants, rarely venturing into Manhattan. Tonight was a rare exception. Rasheed had brought his mother to the Meridian to celebrate closing a $200 million development deal in Dubai. His business partners, 3 American investors named David Chen, Marcus Rothstein, and James Bradford, were joining them for dinner. Rasheed had reluctantly invited his mother, knowing she'd be upset if excluded from such an important celebration. But he'd already decided to position her as a charming cultural curiosity, rather than risk his associates seeing him as anything less than fully Americanized. As they entered the Meridian, Salma moved slowly, her traditional black abaya drawing curious glances from the stylishly dressed crowd. Her weathered hands clutched a small embroidered purse, and her eyes, still sharp and intelligent despite her age, took in the opulent surroundings with quiet observation. She'd protested wearing the abaya, knowing her son preferred she dress more Western, but it was who she was. She wouldn't pretend otherwise. The restaurant buzzed with the controlled energy of wealth and ambition. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light across tables where deals were made and fortunes discussed. The maitre d', a polished man named Gerald Thompson, greeted Rasheed with practiced deference. He'd been briefed that this was a VIP table, the kind that could mean significant future business if handled correctly. "Mr. Al-Mansour, welcome back to the Meridian," Gerald said smoothly. "We have your preferred table ready, the corner with the city view, and may I say, it's an honor to have you celebrating here tonight." Rasheed nodded curtly, his hand on his mother's elbow as he guided her through the dining room. Salma walked with dignity, her back straight despite her years, but Rasheed could feel the stares. He hated it. This feeling of being different, of standing out. In his world of glass towers and corporate boardrooms, he'd become invisible in the best way, just another powerful businessman. But with his mother beside him in her traditional dress, he felt suddenly Exposed, they reached the table where his business partners were already seated, drinks in hand, discussing market trends. David, Marcus, and James stood politely as Rasheed approached, their eyes flickering with curiosity towards Salma. "Gentlemen," Rasheed said, his voice carrying that confident American cadence he'd perfected. "I'd like you to meet my mother, Salma. She's visiting from Brooklyn." He emphasized Brooklyn as if it were her only address, deliberately omitting Jordan, the village, the desert heritage. The men exchanged polite greetings, each shaking Salma's hand with careful formality. She nodded graciously, murmuring greetings in Arabic that none of them understood. An awkward silence followed, the kind that makes seconds feel like minutes. David Chen, a tech investor from San Francisco, smiled uncertainly. Marcus Rothstein, a real estate developer from Boston, cleared his throat. James Bradford, a private equity manager, glanced at Rasheed as if seeking guidance on how to proceed. "Please, everyone sit," Rasheed said quickly, pulling out a chair for his mother. She settled into it with quiet dignity, folding her hands in her lap. The black fabric of her abaya contrasted sharply with the cream-colored upholstery and the gleaming silverware before her. She looked around the table, her dark eyes taking in these American men in their expensive suits, and something in her expression suggested both curiosity and sadness, as if she recognized the distance her son had traveled, not just in miles, but in spirit. As everyone took their seats, Rasheed immediately launched into business talk, deliberately excluding his mother from the conversation by speaking rapidly in English about property values, zoning regulations, and projected returns on investment. It was a calculated move. If she couldn't participate, she'd remain a silent observer, a harmless decoration, rather than a reminder of where he'd come from. The Dubai project is positioned to revolutionize luxury waterfront living in the Gulf region, Rasheed said enthusiastically, pulling up renderings on his tablet. "We're looking at completion in 18 months, with pre-sales already exceeding expectations by 40%. James leaned forward, impressed. "Those numbers are remarkable, Rasheed. You've really cornered the luxury market in the Middle East. How do you maintain such consistent growth?" "It's about understanding what wealthy clients want," Rasheed explained. "They want Western amenities with an exotic backdrop. They want to feel like they're experiencing Arabia without actually having to deal with traditional Arab culture. No offense to tradition," he added with a laugh, not looking at his mother. "But modern luxury requires modern sensibilities." Salma sat quietly, her eyes fixed on the menu she couldn't read. The English words meant nothing to her, and the elaborate descriptions, pan-seared Chilean sea bass with saffron beurre blanc, and herb-crusted Colorado lamb with rosemary juice, might as well have been hieroglyphics. She'd raised her son on simple but delicious food, maklube, mensaf, fragrant rice dishes cooked over open fires. This world of crystal and pretense felt alien to her. She glanced at Rasheed, hoping he might notice her confusion and help her order, but he was deeply engaged in conversation with Marcus about construction timelines. She felt invisible, a ghost, at her own son's celebration. That's when Fatima approached the table. She'd been assigned to this section tonight, and when she saw the elderly woman in traditional dress sitting uncomfortably among the suited businessmen, something stirred in her heart. It was a familiar sight, the cultural disconnect she'd witnessed countless times in her own family. Her grandmother had experienced similar moments when Fatima's father had tried to assimilate too quickly, forgetting where he'd come from. "Good evening," Fatima said warmly, her voice steady and professional. "Welcome to the Meridian. My name is Fatima, and I'll be taking care of you tonight." She made deliberate eye contact with each person at the table, ending with Salma, to whom she offered a particularly kind smile. Rasheed barely glanced up. "We'll start with your 2015 Chateau Margaux," he said dismissively. "Bring us the tasting menu, but make sure everything is halal." He said the last word with slight embarrassment, as if admitting to religious dietary restrictions was a weakness in front of his American colleagues. "Of course, sir," Fatima said. "Chef Sterling can absolutely accommodate." "And for the lady?" She gestured towards Salma with respect. Rasheed waved his hand impatiently. "She'll have whatever we're having. Don't worry about asking her preferences. Just bring whatever's on the tasting menu." Fatima noticed the flash of hurt that crossed Salma's face, quickly masked. The elderly woman understood enough from her son's tone to know she'd been dismissed. Fatima's jaw tightened, but she maintained her professional composure. "I'd be happy to translate the menu for her if that would help," Fatima offered gently, her instincts as a student of Middle Eastern culture overriding her role as a server. Rasheed laughed, a short, sharp sound that made his business partners shift uncomfortably. "That won't be necessary. My mother speaks no English. She's just a simple Bedouin woman from the desert." He said it with a tone that was meant to be charming, self-deprecating humor for his American audience, but the words landed like stones. The words hung in the air like smoke. "My mother speaks no English. She's just a simple Bedouin woman from the desert." Rasheed delivered them with a dismissive chuckle, as if his mother's heritage were a quaint inconvenience, a relic of a world that no longer mattered in the gleaming towers of Manhattan. Something inside Fatima shifted. She'd spent years studying the Middle East, its languages, its cultures, its poetry, its people. She'd learned formal Arabic in university, but it was her grandmother who'd taught her something far more precious. The pure, ancient Bedouin dialect spoken by the tribes who'd roamed the deserts for millennia. It was a language of the heart, filled with proverbs and metaphors drawn from sand and stars and survival. Few young people knew it anymore. It was dying, like so many indigenous languages, crushed under the weight of modernization and shame. But Fatima knew it. She'd spent childhood summers in her grandmother's village, learning to speak the way her ancestors had spoken, understanding that language wasn't just communication, it was identity, memory, belonging. She looked at Salma, who sat with her eyes downcast, trying to disappear into the expensive upholstery. Fatima recognized that posture. She'd seen it in her own grandmother when family members treated her traditional ways as embarrassing. It was the posture of someone whose entire world had been reduced to just simple. Fatima made a decision that would change everything. She knelt slightly beside Salma's chair, bringing herself to eye level with the elderly woman, and spoke in the purest Bedouin dialect, her voice soft but clear. "Ya Ummi al-Karima, ana Fatima. Jaddati kanat min qabilat Bani Sakhr, ma turid an takul al-layla. Ana huna li khidmatik bikulli ihtiram." Honored mother, I am Fatima. My grandmother was from the Bani Sakhr tribe. What would you like to eat tonight? I am here to serve you with all respect. The effect was instantaneous and profound. Salma's head snapped up, her dark eyes suddenly blazing with life. Her entire face transformed. The resignation melted away, replaced by shock, then wonder, then pure joy. Her weathered hands flew to her chest as tears sprang to her eyes. "Anti tata kalam lugati!" "You speak my language," she gasped, her voice trembling with emotion. Ya binti, min aina ta'alamti hada?" My daughter, where did you learn this?" Around the table, the conversation stopped dead. Rasheed's mouth fell open, his rehearsed confidence crumbling. David, Marcus, and James exchanged confused glances, unable to understand the words but perfectly comprehending the emotional earthquake happening before them. Fatima smiled warmly, still speaking in the ancient dialect. "Jaddati alamatan, qalatli, اللغة هي روح الشعب إذا فقدناها فقدنا أنفسنا." My grandmother taught me. She told me, language is the soul of a people. If we lose it, we lose ourselves. Salma reached out and grasped Fatima's hand, squeezing it with surprising strength. Tears rolled down her lined cheeks. Hafadati, kuntu atakid annani wahada huna, garba fa madanat ibn. My granddaughter. I thought I was alone here, a stranger in my son's city. Lasti wadatan abadan ya ummi. You are never alone, mother. Fatima squeezed back, feeling her own eyes prickle with tears. Then, still in Bedouin dialect, Fatima asked gently, Ma huwa atyab ta'am tuhibbanahu? Hal turidun shayan yudakiruki bil bayt? What is the best food you love? Would you like something that reminds you of home? Salma's face lit up completely now, animated and alive. She began describing dishes in flowing, poetic language. Not the simple vocabulary of a restaurant order, but the rich storytelling of someone whose culture treated food as art, as memory, as love. She spoke of lamb slow-cooked with cardamom, of rice that reminded her of wedding celebrations, of bread baked on hot stones under desert stars. Fatima listened intently, nodding with understanding, occasionally asking questions in the same elegant dialect. It was as if the two women had created a bubble of belonging in the middle of this gleaming palace of Western capitalism, a space where Salma wasn't just simple, but extraordinary, a keeper of traditions, a living bridge to a magnificent past. Rasheed sat frozen, his face cycling through emotions, shock, embarrassment, confusion, and something that might have been shame. He'd spent years running from this heritage, and now it had found him in the last place he'd expected, in the mouth of a young waitress in his favorite Manhattan restaurant. The other diners in the restaurant had begun to notice. Conversations at nearby tables grew quieter, heads turned subtly, and a ripple of curiosity spread through the Meridian's dining room. It wasn't every day that such raw emotion erupted in this carefully controlled environment of wealth and refinement. David Chen was the first to break the stunned silence at the table. That was beautiful, he said softly, his voice carrying genuine wonder. I don't understand the language, but I could feel everything you both just said. He looked at Rasheed with something new in his eyes. Not the deference of a business partner seeking approval, but the curiosity of someone who'd just discovered his associate had hidden depths. Marcus Rothstein nodded in agreement. Rasheed, you never mentioned your mother speaks such an eloquent language. The poetry of it was evident even without translation. Rasheed's jaw tightened. His carefully constructed world was cracking, and he could feel the fissures spreading. It's just an old dialect, he said dismissively, but his voice lacked conviction. Not relevant to modern business. Not relevant? James Bradford interjected, leaning back in his chair with a thoughtful expression. I'd argue the opposite. Heritage, authenticity, cultural roots, these are luxury brands' most valuable assets right now. Consumers want stories, connections to something real and ancient. Your mother represents exactly what makes the Middle East fascinating to the Western market. Fatima straightened, preparing to step away professionally, and let the table process what had just happened. But Salma caught her hand again and spoke urgently in Bedouin dialect. La tadhan ya binti. Iktub lahum ma uhibbu an akul. Ibni lam yasalna an ray mundu sanawat. Don't leave me, daughter. Write for them what I would like to eat. My son hasn't asked my opinion in years. Fatima's heart clenched. She looked at Rasheed, then back at Salma, and made another choice, one that went beyond her role as a server. Mrs. Al-Mansur would like me to take her personal order, she said clearly, addressing the table with professional authority. She has specific preferences she'd like to share. Rasheed opened his mouth to protest, but David cut him off. Of course. Please go ahead. We'd be honored to hear what she'd like. There was a pointed edge to his words, a subtle reproach that Rasheed couldn't miss. Fatima pulled out her notepad, still speaking to Salma in Bedouin dialect. Kulli ya ummi wa sa'uratib kulla shay ma'a at-tabak. Tell me, mother, and I will arrange everything with the chef. Salma's face glowed with gratitude. She began describing her preferences, not demanding, but sharing as one might with a beloved granddaughter. She wanted the lamb, yes, but prepared with specific spices that reminded her of home. She wanted rice, but not the saffron-infused European style. Something simpler, more honest. She spoke of flavors and memories, of her mother's cooking, of celebrations in the desert when families gathered under endless stars. Fatima translated portions for the table, but she edited carefully, preserving Salma's dignity. Mrs. Al-Mansour would prefer the lamb prepared with traditional Arabian spices, cardamom, cinnamon, and black lime. She'd like the rice prepared simply, and if possible, some fresh flatbread. She paused, then added with deliberate emphasis. She also shared that in her culture, food is never just sustenance. It's memory, hospitality, and love made tangible. Every dish tells a story. Marcus nodded slowly. That's profound. That's exactly the kind of authentic narrative that resonates with people. Rasheed's face had gone from red to pale. His mother had just been validated by his business partners, the very people whose respect he'd been so desperate to maintain. The irony wasn't lost on anyone at the table. Fatima finished taking notes and met Rasheed's eyes steadily. There was no triumph in her gaze, only quiet dignity. I'll have Chef Sterling personally prepare everything to honor Mrs. Al-Mansour's preferences, she said. It may take slightly longer than the standard tasting menu, but I believe it will be worth the wait. Take all the time needed, James said firmly. This is clearly a special occasion, and not just because of the Dubai deal. As Fatima walked toward the kitchen, she could feel Salma's grateful eyes following her. She could also feel the weight of what she'd just done. In the hierarchy of fine dining, servers were meant to be invisible facilitators, not cultural ambassadors who challenged the table's power dynamics. She might face consequences for overstepping her role. But as she pushed through the kitchen doors and approached Chef Sterling, a gruff perfectionist who nonetheless had a deep respect for culinary traditions, she knew she'd made the right choice. "Chef," she said, "I need your help with something special." Chef Marcus Sterling was in the middle of plating a delicate duck confit when Fatima approached him. He was a tall man in his early 50s, with silver hair pulled back in a tight ponytail and hands that moved with the precision of a surgeon. His kitchen was his domain, and he ran it with exacting standards that made grown sous chefs tremble. But beneath the intensity was a craftsman who genuinely loved food. Not just the technique, but the stories and traditions behind every dish. "Chef, I need your help with something special," Fatima said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. Marcus looked up, his sharp blue eyes assessing her. "Special how?" "We're already running the tasting menu for table 12. Everything's been prepped according to spec." Fatima took a breath. The elderly woman at that table, Mrs. Al-Mansour, she's Bedouin, from Jordan. Her son ordered for her without asking what she wanted. I spoke with her in her native dialect, and she has specific requests. Traditional preparations, dishes that honor her heritage. Something shifted in Marcus's expression. He set down his tweezers and wiped his hands on his apron. "Tell me exactly what she wants." Fatima described Salma's requests in detail. The lamb with cardamom, cinnamon, and black lime, rice prepared simply with ghee and toasted pine nuts, fresh flatbread if possible, small dishes of yogurt with cucumber and mint. She explained the cultural significance, how each element connected to Salma's memories and traditions. Marcus listened intently, then nodded slowly. "I trained for 6 months in a restaurant in Amman years ago, before I chased Michelin stars and forgot why I started cooking in the first place." He called over his sous chef, a young woman named Claire Rodriguez. Change of plans for table 12. We're doing something real tonight. The kitchen energy shifted immediately. Word spread quickly among the staff. The waitress, who spoke ancient Bedouin, had stood up for an elderly woman whose own son had dismissed her. There was something romantic about it, something that reminded everyone why they'd fallen in love with food and service in the first place. It wasn't about impressing critics or Instagram influencers. It was about nourishment, connection, dignity. Marcus pulled ingredients with focused intensity. The lamb. We'll prepare it with a traditional spice blend. Forget the French techniques. We'll slow roast it the way her grandmother probably did, letting the spices penetrate deep. He turned to his prep cook. Toast the cardamom pods, cinnamon sticks, and dried black limes. Fresh grind, maximum aromatics. Claire started on the rice, cooking it in lamb broth with ghee, keeping it simple and fragrant. Another cook began making fresh flatbread from scratch. No time for a proper tandoor technique, but they'd use the pizza oven at high heat to achieve the char and texture. Meanwhile, back in the dining room, the atmosphere at table 12 remained tense. Rasheed had tried multiple times to steer the conversation back to business, but his partners kept circling back to culture, heritage, and authenticity. It was as if Fatima's simple act of linguistic bridge-building had fundamentally altered the evening's trajectory. "You know, Rasheed," David said thoughtfully, swirling wine in his glass, "the most successful developments we've invested in lately are the ones with authentic cultural storytelling, not the generic luxury stuff, the places that feel rooted in something real. Your Dubai project has all the right features, but maybe it's missing soul." Rasheed bristled. "The pre-sales numbers suggest otherwise." "Numbers tell one story," Marcus Rothstein countered. "But sustainability, real, long-term value, comes from meaning. Your mother sitting here tonight, that's meaning. The way that waitress honored her, that's meaning. Maybe you've been so focused on escaping your past that you've overlooked its value." Salma sat quietly, understanding none of the English conversation, but reading her son's body language perfectly. She'd watched him transform over the years, watched him file away every rough edge that connected him to his origins. She'd said nothing, believing a mother's job was to support her child's choices. But tonight, for the first time in years, someone had seen her, truly seen her, not as Rasheed's embarrassing baggage, but as a person with worth, with history, with wisdom. She reached across the table and placed her hand on Rasheed's arm, speaking softly in Arabic. "Ya ibni, la takun khashiyan min makani ataytu minhu. Al-judhur la tu'ayyifu ash-shajara, taqawwaha." "My son, don't be ashamed of where I came from. Roots don't weaken the tree, they strengthen it." Rasheed understood every word. He'd pretended for years that his Arabic was rusty, but it wasn't. He'd simply chosen not to use it. 20 minutes later, Fatima emerged from the kitchen carrying a tray that looked nothing like the Meridian's typical refined presentations. Instead of architectural towers of foam and microgreens, she bore dishes that steamed with honest fragrance, the kind that spoke of home fires and grandmother's kitchens and meals shared under open sky. She approached table 12 with quiet confidence, aware that every eye in the restaurant had periodically glanced their way throughout the evening. What had started as curiosity about the elderly woman in traditional dress had evolved into something more. People sensed they were witnessing something significant, even if they couldn't quite articulate what. "Mrs. Al-Mansour," Fatima said softly in Bedouin dialect, "Chef Sterling has prepared everything with great care and respect for your traditions." She set before Salma a platter of lamb that had been slow roasted until tender, its surface crusted with toasted spices that released waves of cardamom, cinnamon, and the distinctive citrus smoke note of black lime. Beside it came a dish of rice so simple it was revolutionary in this temple of culinary complexity. just grains glistening with ghee, studded with toasted pine nuts, fragrant with subtle lamb broth. Fresh flatbread, still warm, arrived in a basket wrapped with linen. Small bowls of yogurt with cucumber, mint, and a drizzle of olive oil completed the spread. Salma's reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Her hands flew to her mouth, tears spilling down her weathered cheeks as the aromas hit her. "Allahu Akbar," she whispered. "Hada ta'am umma, hada bait." God is great. This is my mother's food. This is my home. She looked at Fatima with such profound gratitude that the younger woman felt her own eyes well up. Fatima squeezed Salma's shoulder gently before serving the men their courses. Elegant versions of the tasting menu, beautiful but suddenly seeming almost hollow in comparison to the emotional richness of Salma's meal. Salma closed her eyes and took her first bite of lamb. The taste transported her instantly, back to her mother's tent, to wedding celebrations, to the communal meals where entire tribes gathered and shared not just food, but stories, songs, poetry, life itself. She'd spent 2 years in New York eating food that sustained her body but starved her soul. This meal was resurrection. She began to eat with genuine pleasure, occasionally murmuring appreciations in her dialect. The men at the table watched, fascinated. Even without understanding her words, they could see the profound satisfaction, the way food could be more than fuel. It could be memory made tangible, identity affirmed, love expressed. "Your mother seems very happy," David observed to Rasheed, his tone gentle but pointed. Rasheed nodded, unable to speak. He was watching his mother transform before his eyes, her posture straightening, her eyes brightening, her entire presence expanding as if she'd been compressed for so long and was finally allowed to unfold. When had he last seen her this alive? When had he last asked her what she wanted, what she needed, what she remembered? James tasted his own lamb, a different preparation, deconstructed and modern, and glanced at Salma's plate. "I have to say, Rasheed, her version looks better than ours." He smiled to soften the observation, but the message was clear. Marcus Rothstein was more direct. "You know what I'm thinking? Your Dubai project, instead of making it just another generic luxury development, what if you incorporated authentic Bedouin elements? Not as kitsch, but as genuine cultural touchstones. Traditional textiles, architectural elements, storytelling spaces. Partner with craftspeople who still practice the old ways. Create something that has soul, not just square footage." David jumped in enthusiastically. "Exactly. The wellness trend is huge right now, but it's all Balinese spas and Japanese onsen. What about desert wisdom, Bedouin hospitality traditions? There's a whole untapped market for authentic Arabian heritage experiences." Rasheed felt something cracking inside him, not breaking, but opening. These men he'd worked so hard to impress weren't impressed by his rejection of his roots. They were impressed by the roots themselves. The very things he'd tried to bury were actually treasures he'd been sitting on, too ashamed to dig them up. Fatima returned to check on the table, and Salma immediately beckoned her closer. In Bedouin dialect, the elderly woman spoke urgently, "Kule lil tabakh, baraka Allahu fahi, aada li ruha." "May tell the chef, may God bless him, he returned my soul to me." Fatima translated for the table, her voice thick with emotion. "Mrs. Al-Mansour wants Chef Sterling to know that his cooking has restored her spirit." There was a moment of profound silence. Then James raised his wine glass. "To Mrs. Al-Mansour," he said solemnly, "and to heritage, the real luxury none of us can afford to lose." The rest of the meal passed in a strange, suspended atmosphere. The business partners continued their animated discussion about authenticity and cultural heritage, sketching ideas on napkins and pulling up examples on their phones of successful developments that had honored local traditions. Salma ate slowly, savoring every bite, occasionally offering comments in Arabic that Fatima translated when she returned to check on the table. But Rasheed had gone quiet. He picked at his food without tasting it, his mind churning through decades of choices, of deliberate distancing, of shame he'd never admitted even to himself. He watched his mother laugh, actually laugh, as she described to Fatima a memory triggered by the rice, a wedding feast when she was 16, where her grandmother had taught her the exact way to toast pine nuts until they released their sweet, buttery essence. When had he last heard his mother laugh like that? Open, unguarded, joyful. He remembered being 12 years old, newly arrived in America for boarding school, desperately trying to erase his accent. A classmate had mocked the lunch his mother had packed, grape leaves stuffed with rice, fragrant with lemon and olive oil. "What is that weird stuff?" The boy had sneered. "Doesn't your family know how to make normal food?" Rasheed had thrown the lunch away and asked his mother to pack peanut butter sandwiches from then on. He'd seen the hurt in her eyes, but she'd complied. She'd always complied with his requests to be more American, less Arab, less visible, less herself. Over the years, he'd built an empire on the foundation of that childhood shame. Every success had been another brick in the wall between who he'd been and who he'd become. But now, watching his mother glow with dignity because a young waitress had seen her, really seen her, Rasheed felt that wall crumbling. "Excuse me," he said abruptly, standing from the table. "I need a moment." He walked quickly toward the restaurant's hallway, past the restrooms, to a quiet alcove where floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the glittering cityscape. Manhattan spread before him like a constellation of ambition, every light representing someone's dream, someone's hustle, someone's transformation. But at what cost? He pressed his forehead against the cool glass, eyes burning with unshed tears. He'd built a fortune, yes. He'd earned respect, certainly, but he'd traded his soul for it, piece by piece, until he'd become a man his own mother couldn't fully recognize. Mr. Al-Mansour. He turned to find Fatima standing a respectful distance away, her expression concerned, but not pitying. "Your mother asked me to check on you," she said softly. She was worried. Rasheed laughed bitterly. "Of course she was. She's always worried about me. I'm the one who's never worried about her." He paused, then asked, "What exactly did my mother say to you? In our dialect, I mean, when you first spoke to her." Fatima considered her words carefully. "She said she felt invisible in your city, that she'd begun to believe she was a burden to you. When I spoke to her in Bedouin, she said it was the first time in 2 years she'd felt like herself, like she mattered beyond being someone's mother." The words hit Rasheed like physical blows. "I've been trying so hard to prove I belong here," he said quietly. "I never stopped to think about whether she belongs, or if I've been making her feel like she doesn't." "Heritage isn't weakness," Fatima said gently. "It's foundation. I study Middle Eastern cultures at NYU, not because I want to live in the past, but because understanding where we come from helps us build better futures. The students who struggle most are the ones trying to erase their backgrounds instead of integrating them." Rasheed looked at this young woman, a waitress working her way through graduate school, someone who probably earned in a month what he spent on a suit, and realized she possessed a wisdom he'd lost somewhere along his climb to success. "How did you learn to speak like that?" he asked. "The old dialect, I mean. Not many young people know it anymore. My grandmother, she was like your mother, traditional, rooted, proud of who she was. She died last year." Fatima's voice caught slightly. "Before she passed, she made me promise I'd never be ashamed of speaking our language, of honoring our ways. She said, 'The world will try to make you smaller, Fatima. Don't help them." Rasheed nodded slowly, understanding blooming in his chest like pain and relief mixed together. "I've been helping them, haven't I? By being ashamed of her, I made her smaller." "You can change that," Fatima said simply. "Right now, tonight. It's never too late to honor the people who gave you life." They stood in silence for a moment, the city glittering beyond the glass, full of possibility and second chances. Finally, Rasheed straightened his shoulders. "Thank you," he said, "for seeing her, for speaking to her, for reminding me who I am." When Rasheed returned to the table, something fundamental had shifted in his bearing. He moved differently, not with the aggressive confidence of a man trying to prove something, but with the quiet dignity of someone who'd finally stopped running. His business partners looked up expectantly, but Rasheed's attention went immediately to his mother. He pulled his chair closer to hers, something he hadn't done in years, always maintaining physical distance as if her traditional presence might be contagious. Then, in clear, beautiful Bedouin dialect, the language of his childhood, the words his father had taught him, the poetry his grandmother had recited, he spoke to her. "Ya ummi, atlubu minki as-sama, kuntu khaifan, wa fil khawf ja'altuki tashta'irna bi'al-ar. Anti lasti ib, anti karamat wa quwwatu wa kuluma huwa saha, fahadha al-alam." "Mother, I ask your forgiveness. I was afraid, and in my fear, I made you feel ashamed. You are not my shame. You are my dignity, my strength, and everything that is right in this world." The restaurant fell silent. Nearby diners stopped mid-conversation, drawn by the raw emotion in Rasheed's voice. Even without understanding the words, people sensed they were witnessing something sacred. A son finding his way back to his mother, to himself. Salma's eyes filled with tears. Her hands trembled as she reached for her son's face, cupping his cheeks the way she had when he was a boy. "Ya ibni, ya habibi," she whispered. "My son, my beloved. Lam akun ghadibatan minki abadan, kuntu faqat haznatan li'annaka tabdu taburdan." I was never angry with you. I was only sad because you seemed so far away. Rasheed took his mother's weathered hands in his own and continued speaking in their dialect, his voice breaking with emotion. "Ana huna al-an, wa lanabta'ida marra ukhra. أريدك أن تعرف أن كل شيء أسبحته، كل نجاح حققته، هو بسبب التربية التي أعطيت نوعها. تعلمت الإصرار منك، تعلمت الكرامة منك. لقد كنت أحمق لأني خجعت من هذا. I am here now, and I won't go away again. I want you to know that everything I've become, every success I've achieved, is because of the upbringing you gave me. I learned perseverance from you. I learned dignity from you. I was a fool to be ashamed of this." The business partners exchanged glances, deeply moved by what they were witnessing. David Chen felt his own eyes prickling with unexpected tears. His own parents were immigrants from Taiwan, and he recognized this moment, the reckoning between generations, between old world and new, between shame and pride. Marcus Rothstein leaned back in his chair, a slow smile spreading across his face. "Now this," he said quietly to James, "this is the authenticity I was talking about. A man who can honor his mother, who can speak her language, who understands where he comes from. This is someone I want to do business with for the long term." James nodded in agreement. The Dubai project just got a lot more interesting. Fatima had been watching from a discreet distance, and now she approached the table one final time. She knelt beside Salma and said softly in Bedouin, "Alhamdulillah, salaha ma kana maksuran." Thanks be to God. What was broken has been mended. Salma pulled Fatima into an embrace, holding her tightly. "Shukran, ya bint. Jazaki Allahu khairan. Rajat ibni ilayya." "Thank you, my daughter. May God reward you with goodness. You returned my son to me." When they separated, Salma reached for her purse and pulled out a delicate silver bracelet, clearly old, clearly precious. She pressed it into Fatima's hands, speaking urgently, "Hada kana li walidata wa li walidatiha qablaha. Uriduki an tahmilahi. Anti hafiza at-tilugat, hafiza at-taqla'ad. Anti jisru bayn al-madi wal-mustaqbal." This was my mother's and her mother's before her. I want you to carry it. You are a keeper of language, a keeper of traditions. You are a bridge between past and future. Fatima tried to protest. It was too much, too valuable. But Salma insisted with the authority of a matriarch who would not be denied. Finally, Fatima accepted, slipping the bracelet onto her wrist, where it caught the light, ancient silver against young skin. Rasheed watched this exchange, and something in him settled. "Miss Fatima," he said, switching to English, "my partners and I are redesigning our Dubai project to incorporate authentic Bedouin cultural elements. Would you consider consulting with us? Your knowledge, your respect for the traditions, we need that. I need that." The evening ended not with the dramatic exit Rasheed had originally planned, but with lingering conversation, shared dessert, and the kind of laughter that comes when walls have been torn down. The business partners insisted on taking photos with Salma, treating her not as a curiosity, but as an honored elder whose wisdom they genuinely valued. She beamed in every picture, her dignity fully restored. When the check came, Rasheed barely glanced at it before adding a tip that made Fatima's eyes widen, enough to cover 2 months of her tuition. But more importantly, he'd written a note on the receipt in both English and Arabic. "Thank you for reminding me who I am. You didn't just serve my mother tonight, you saved me." As the party prepared to leave, Chef Sterling emerged from the kitchen, wiping his hands on his apron. He approached Salma and, in halting but respectful Arabic, told her it had been an honor to cook for her. She clasped his hands and blessed him in the traditional Bedouin way, placing her palm on his forehead and speaking words of gratitude that needed no translation. The other diners in the restaurant had witnessed enough of the evening's transformation that several approached Fatima afterward, praising her for what she'd done. One woman, a prominent food critic for the New York Times, asked for her contact information. "That was the most meaningful service I've seen in 20 years of reviewing restaurants," she said. "When I write about this place, you're going to be the heart of the story." 3 weeks later, the article appeared. It wasn't just a restaurant review. It was a meditation on dignity, heritage, and the power of being seen. The critic described watching a young waitress honor an elderly woman in a language most Americans had never heard, and how that simple act had transformed not just a meal, but the entire room's understanding of what true luxury meant. "At the Meridian," she wrote, "I witnessed something rarer than a perfect Michelin-starred meal. I witnessed humanity elevated by the simple, revolutionary act of respect." The article went viral. Food magazines picked it up. Social media exploded with discussions about cultural pride, intergenerational relationships, and the immigrant experience. Number You Can't Buy Decency trended again, this time with a specifically cultural dimension. People shared stories of their own grandmothers, their own languages, their own moments of being seen or unseen. For Fatima, everything changed. The consulting offer from Rasheed was real. He'd brought her onto his team as a cultural advisor for the Dubai project, paying her more than she'd made in a year of waitressing. She was able to focus full-time on her graduate studies while contributing to a development that would honor Bedouin traditions rather than erase them. The project would feature traditional textile installations from actual Bedouin artisans, storytelling spaces designed around desert-gathering customs, and architectural elements inspired by historic caravan routes. Rasheed and Salma's relationship transformed completely. He moved her from her modest Brooklyn apartment to a beautiful space in his building, not to control her, but to be closer to her. He began taking Arabic lessons to reclaim the fluency he'd deliberately lost, and started joining her at the Bay Ridge Community Center where other Arab elders gathered. He listened to their stories, their wisdom, their memories. He introduced them to his business partners as consultants, paying them fairly for their cultural knowledge. Most importantly, he stopped being ashamed. When Forbes did a follow-up profile after the Times article, Rasheed spoke openly about his Bedouin heritage, about his mother's influence, about the years he'd wasted trying to be someone he wasn't. "I thought success meant becoming American," he told the interviewer. "I didn't understand that real success means becoming yourself, fully, authentically, without apology." 6 months after that night at the Meridian, Fatima graduated with her master's degree. Salma attended the ceremony, sitting in the front row beside Rasheed, both of them beaming with pride. Afterward, at the celebration dinner, held at the Meridian naturally, Salma gave a toast in Bedouin dialect that Fatima translated for the gathered friends and family. "My grandmother used to say that language is not just words," Salma said. "It is memory made breath, identity made sound, love made tangible. When we lose our language, we lose ourselves. When someone speaks our language back to us, they return our souls." She looked at Fatima with tears in her eyes. "This daughter of my heart gave me back my soul. She reminded my son of his, and she showed a restaurant full of strangers that dignity exists in all languages." The bracelet glinted on Fatima's wrist, silver passed down through generations, now carried forward by someone who understood its weight and worth. And so ends the story of how a single act of linguistic bridge building transformed lives, businesses, and understandings. Fatima's willingness to see Salma, truly see her, in her own language, sparked a chain reaction that proved heritage isn't weakness, but foundation. Sometimes it takes just one sentence in the right language to remind us who we really are. Thank you for reading. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear that their language, their culture, their grandmother's wisdom matters. Remember, dignity exists in all languages, and you never know when speaking from your authentic self will change not just your life, but someone else's world.